There comes a moment in an empath's life when something subtle yet profound begins to shift. For a long time, they've lived as emotional sponges, absorbing, feeling, carrying what was never truly theirs. They walked into rooms and felt everything: the tension, the sadness, the unspoken pain. And because they felt it so deeply, they believed, often without realizing it, that it was their responsibility to ease it, to fix it, to make it better. But over time, that constant absorption comes at a cost. It drains, it confuses, it blurs the line between what belongs to them and what belongs to others. And eventually, the empath reaches a point where they can no longer afford that confusion. Not because they've become cold, but because they've become aware. This is where the shift begins. Instead of immediately merging with every emotional current around them, they start to pause. They notice. They begin to ask a different kind of question. Not how do I fix this, but is this even mine to carry? That single question changes everything. Emotions that once felt overwhelming begin to take on a different quality. They're still felt, but now they're observed. There's a space that didn't exist before, a quiet distance between the feeling and the self. And in that space, something powerful happens. Choice. They begin to choose what to take in and what to let pass through. It's not that their sensitivity disappears. In fact, it often becomes sharper. But instead of being pulled under by it, they stand within it, grounded. What once felt like chaos becomes information. They can sense when someone is hurting, but they no longer assume it's their role to heal that hurt. They can recognize tension without becoming tense themselves. This is emotional mastery. Not control in the rigid sense, but a kind of deep, embodied understanding. A knowing that says, I can feel this without becoming it. And with that comes a quiet strength. Because when you are no longer overwhelmed by what you feel, you stop reacting impulsively. You stop trying to manage other people's emotional states just to find your own sense of calm. Instead, your calm comes from within. It becomes steady, less dependent on what's happening around you. This is often misunderstood by others. People who were used to the empath's constant availability may sense the change. They may feel the absence of that immediate emotional responsiveness and interpret it as distance or even indifference. But it's neither. It's clarity. The empath is no longer abandoning themselves to maintain connection. And perhaps the most important part of this transformation is that they begin to reclaim their identity. For so long, they defined themselves through others, through how much they could feel, how much they could give, how much they could hold. But now, they begin to understand that their worth is not measured by their emotional labor. They start to feel their own emotions more clearly, without interference. Their own needs, their own limits, their own truths rise to the surface. And instead of pushing those aside, they begin to honor them. This doesn't make them less empathetic. It makes their empathy cleaner, more honest. It's no longer tangled in obligation or guilt. It becomes intentional. And in that intention there is power. Because an empath who can feel deeply and still remain centered is no longer easily manipulated, no longer easily drained. They are present, aware, and grounded in themselves. They haven't lost their sensitivity. They've finally learned how to stand within it. And that's the moment everything changes. They stop absorbing the world and start understanding it. And as this inner shift deepens, something else begins to change. Something that can feel almost uncomfortable at first, especially for someone who has spent a lifetime explaining themselves. The empath, who once felt the need to clarify every intention, justify every boundary, and soften every truth, starts to grow quiet, not withdrawn, not disconnected. Just quiet in a different way. There was a time when silence felt unsafe, when not speaking up meant being misunderstood, overlooked, or even rejected. So they learned to over-communicate, to fill in every gap, to anticipate every reaction, to make sure no one ever felt confused about where they stood. But beneath that effort was often a deeper fear, the fear that if they didn't explain themselves enough, they wouldn't be accepted. Now something has shifted. They begin to realize that not everyone is listening to understand. Some are listening to respond, to control, to reinterpret, and no amount of explanation can reach someone who has already decided not to hear you. This realization is not bitter, it's liberating, so the empath begins to step back from the exhausting cycle of over-explaining. They start to recognize that clarity doesn't always require more words. Sometimes clarity is a simple decision, a boundary held without justification, a choice made without seeking approval, and perhaps most powerfully, a silence that speaks for itself. This silence is not passive, it's not avoidance, it's a form of self-respect. They stop engaging in conversations that go in circles. They stop defending their feelings to people who dismiss them. They stop trying to convince others of their worth. And in doing so, they conserve something incredibly valuable, their energy, because every unnecessary explanation is, in a way, an emotional negotiation, a subtle attempt to earn understanding. And when that understanding doesn't come, it leaves behind frustration, depletion, even self-doubt. But in this stage, the empath begins to trust something deeper than external validation. They trust their own perception, their own experience, their own truth. And so they speak when it matters, but they no longer feel compelled to speak all the time. You'll notice it in the way they respond. There's less urgency, less need to react immediately. They take a pause. They allow space. And in that space, they choose their words carefully. Or sometimes they choose not to use words at all. To others, this can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling. People who were used to constant access to the empath's thoughts, feelings, and reassurance may interpret this silence as distance. They may push for explanations, for reactions, for the old patterns to return. But the empath understands now. Not every demand deserves a response. There is a quiet confidence that begins to emerge. A sense that says, I don't need to prove myself to be at peace. And that confidence doesn't come from shutting people out. It comes from no longer abandoning oneself in order to keep others comfortable. This is where silence becomes a boundary that says, I will not engage in what harms me. A boundary that says, I don't owe constant access to my inner world. A boundary that says, my presence is a choice, not an obligation. And in this silence, something remarkable happens. The empath becomes more grounded, more centered, more present. Without the noise of constant explanation, they can actually hear themselves more clearly. Their intuition sharpens. Their decisions become cleaner. Their relationships become more honest, because they are no longer built on over-accommodation, but on mutual respect. Silence in this sense is not emptiness. It's alignment. It's the space where truth no longer needs to be defended, because it is simply lived. And when an empath reaches this point, their presence carries a different kind of weight. They don't need to raise their voice to be heard. They don't need to argue to be understood. There is a quiet authority in the way they move, the way they respond, or choose not to, because they've learned something many people spend a lifetime chasing. Not everything needs a reaction, and not everyone deserves access to your voice. And as this quiet strength continues to take shape, the empath begins to encounter a deeper, more nuanced challenge. How to care without losing themselves in that care. Because for much of their life, love and sacrifice were intertwined. To care meant to give, and to give often meant to overextend, to ignore their own limits, to say yes when something inside them was clearly saying no. But now something in them resists that old pattern. They still feel deeply. They still notice the pain in others, the subtle cues, the emotional undercurrents. That hasn't gone away. If anything, it has become more refined. But what has changed is their relationship to that awareness. They no longer interpret someone else's pain as a call to abandon themselves. There is a quiet recognition that begins to take root. Caring does not require self-sacrifice, and that realization can feel uncomfortable at first. Because when you've spent so long equating love with giving everything, choosing not to overgive can feel like you're doing something wrong. There can be guilt, a lingering voice that says, you should be doing more, you should be helping, you should be there no matter the cost. But the empath at this stage starts to question that voice. They begin to see that much of that conditioning didn't come from a place of true connection. It often came from a need to maintain attachment, to avoid conflict, to earn belonging. And when you start to see that clearly, something shifts. You begin to understand that love rooted in self-abandonment is not sustainable. It leads to resentment, exhaustion, and a quiet sense of invisibility. So the empath starts to practice something new, staying present with others without taking responsibility for what isn't theirs. They can sit with someone in pain, listen deeply, offer genuine compassion, but they no longer feel compelled to fix, rescue, or absorb. They allow the other person to have their experience, without making it their own burden to carry. This is what healthy detachment looks like. It's not indifference. It's not emotional withdrawal. It's the ability to remain connected without becoming entangled, to care without controlling, to support without losing your center. And in many ways, this kind of detachment is an act of respect, not only for oneself, but for the other person as well. Because when you stop trying to fix someone, you're also acknowledging their capacity to face their own life, their own challenges. You're no longer placing yourself in the role of the one who must hold everything together. That shift changes the dynamic of relationships. The empath is no longer the one who overfunctions while others underfunction. There is a rebalancing that begins to occur. Some relationships may naturally fall away, especially those that were built on the empath's overgiving. Others may deepen, becoming more reciprocal, more grounded, more honest. And through this process, the empath learns something essential. Compassion does not mean closeness at any cost. There are moments when the most compassionate thing you can do is step back, to create distance, to say, without words, I care about you, but I will not lose myself in this. That kind of boundary is not rejection. It is clarity, and it allows the empath to preserve their own well-being, their own emotional integrity. Because without that, even the purest intention to care becomes distorted. It turns into obligation, into depletion, into something that quietly erodes the self. But when compassion is paired with boundaries, something beautiful happens. It becomes sustainable. It becomes clean. It no longer drains. It nourishes both the giver and the receiver. the empath begins to feel a different kind of connection, one that doesn't require constant effort to maintain, one that allows space, individuality, and mutual responsibility. And perhaps most importantly, they begin to include themselves in their own compassion. They start to listen to their own limits, to honor their own needs, to recognize when something feels off, and to respond to that feeling instead of overriding it. This is not selfishness, it is maturity. Because true empathy is not just about feeling others, it's about holding space for yourself within that feeling. And when an empath learns to care without losing themselves, they step into a kind of strength that is both gentle and unshakable. They no longer love in a way that depletes them. They love in a way that sustains them. As this deeper sense of balance takes hold, something almost instinctive begins to sharpen within the empath. It's not something new, exactly. It's something that was always there, but buried under layers of doubt, second-guessing, and the habit of giving others the benefit of the doubt at their own expense. Now they begin to see clearly. Where once they might have overlooked subtle inconsistencies, they now notice them immediately. A tone that doesn't match the words. A pattern of behavior that repeats beneath different excuses. A kindness that feels conditional. These things don't pass unnoticed anymore. Not because the empath has become suspicious, but because they have become present. Presence reveals patterns. And patterns, when you're willing to see them, tell the truth far more reliably than promises ever do. In the past, the empath might have sensed something was off, but quickly talked themselves out of it. They might have thought, maybe I'm overreacting, or they didn't mean it that way, or I just need to be more understanding. That inner voice of intuition was often overridden by the desire to maintain harmony, to avoid conflict, to keep the connection intact. But now something has changed in how they relate to that inner voice. They start to trust it, not blindly, not impulsively, but with a grounded kind of respect. When something feels misaligned, they don't rush to dismiss it. They sit with it. They observe. And more often than not, what they sense begins to reveal itself over time, not through confrontation, but through consistency. This is where a quiet kind of discernment develops. They begin to understand that not everything needs to be called out. Not every truth needs to be spoken aloud to be valid. Sometimes, simply seeing clearly is enough. Because once you truly see something, you can't unsee it, and your behavior naturally begins to adjust. You show up differently. You engage differently. You invest differently, and that's where the real power lies. Because instead of trying to change others, the empath starts to change their level of participation. They no longer argue with reality. They no longer try to convince someone to be who they are not. If someone shows a pattern of dishonesty, they stop expecting honesty. If someone repeatedly crosses boundaries, they stop offering access. There's no drama in this shift. No need to prove a point. It's quiet, almost invisible from the outside, but deeply transformative from within. And for those who were accustomed to the empath's previous openness, this change can feel unsettling. They may sense that something is different, that the same behaviors no longer yield the same responses. The empath is no longer as easily pulled into emotional dynamics that once consumed them, because they've learned to recognize the pattern before it fully unfolds. They see the beginning of what used to become a cycle, and they choose not to step into it. This isn't about judgment. It's about clarity. The empath isn't labeling people as good or bad. They're simply recognizing what is without distortion. And in doing so, they free themselves from the exhausting task of trying to reinterpret or excuse what doesn't feel right. There is a kind of peace in that clarity. Because when you stop arguing with your own perception, you reclaim a tremendous amount of energy. You're no longer caught in the inner conflict of, am I imagining this? Or should I give it one more chance? You begin to respond from a place of knowing rather than uncertainty. And that knowing doesn't need validation. It stands on its own, quietly guiding your choices. The empath, at this stage, doesn't need to expose every manipulation or confront every inconsistency. They understand that people reveal themselves over time, and that truth doesn't need to be forced. It simply needs to be seen, and once it's seen, the response becomes simple. Not always easy, but simple. You step back when something isn't aligned. You stay when it is. You invest where there is reciprocity, and you withdraw where there is not. No overthinking, no over-explaining. Just a steady alignment between what you see and how you respond. This is what it means to move through the world with awareness. Not guarded, not closed, but awake. And when an empath reaches this level of clarity, they become incredibly difficult to deceive. Not because they're looking for deception, but because they've finally learned to trust what they see. They don't chase truth anymore. They recognize it the moment it appears. And as this clarity becomes more stable, the empath begins to notice something that may have been invisible before. Just how much of their life was spent giving energy away without ever questioning where it was going. Not out of weakness, but out of habit. Out of a deeply ingrained belief that their role was to be available, to be supportive, to be the one who could always be counted on, no matter the cost. But now there is a different awareness. a quieter, more grounded realization that their energy is not an unlimited resource. It is not something to be poured endlessly into every person, every situation, every emotional demand. It is something finite, something valuable, something that requires care, and with that awareness comes a shift in priority. They begin to notice how certain interactions leave them feeling, not just in the moment, but afterward. The lingering heaviness after a conversation where they did all the emotional lifting. The subtle exhaustion that follows being around someone who constantly takes but rarely gives. The tension that builds when they say yes, even though something inside them is resisting. These signals, which were once ignored or minimized, now become important. They begin to listen, and in listening they start to make different choices. They no longer agree to things automatically. They pause. They check in with themselves. Do I actually have the capacity for this? Is this aligned with what I need right now? These questions become a kind of internal compass, guiding them away from depletion and toward balance. It's not always comfortable. Because saying no, especially for someone who has built their identity around being there for others, can feel unfamiliar. There can be guilt. There can be a sense of letting people down. But alongside that discomfort, there is also something new, a sense of self-respect. Because every time they choose not to overextend, they are reinforcing a different message to themselves, that their well-being matters. They start to become more intentional with their time and attention, not in a rigid or controlling way, but in a conscious one. They begin to recognize that where their attention goes, their energy follows. And so, they choose more carefully. They invest in conversations that feel reciprocal, in relationships where there's mutual care, in environments that don't require them to shrink or overperform just to belong. And just as importantly, they begin to step back from what consistently drains them, not with resentment, not with blame, but with clarity. There is a quiet understanding that not every connection is meant to be maintained at the same level. Some people can be cared about from a distance. Some dynamics are better left behind, and letting go of those doesn't make them unkind. It makes them honest. This is where the empath begins to reclaim a sense of balance that may have been missing for a long time. They are no longer operating from a place of constant output. They begin to allow themselves to receive, to rest, to be without always doing. And in that space, something begins to restore itself. Their energy becomes steadier, more consistent, less reactive. They are not as easily pulled into emotional turbulence because they are no longer overcommitted. They have created space within themselves, space that allows them to respond thoughtfully rather than react automatically. And that space is powerful because when you are not constantly drained, you begin to show up differently. You have more presence, more clarity, more patience, not because you are trying harder, but because you are no longer running on empty. The empath starts to understand that their capacity to care is actually strengthened when it is protected. That giving becomes more meaningful when it is not done out of obligation, but out of genuine willingness. And perhaps most importantly, they begin to experience a different kind of relationship with themselves. One that is not based on how much they can give, but on how well they can listen inward, on how honestly they can respond to their own needs, on how consistently they can choose alignment over approval. This is not about becoming unavailable. It's about becoming intentional, because when you treat your energy as something sacred, your life begins to reflect that value. And when an empath reaches this point, they no longer feel the need to be everything for everyone. They choose where they give, and in that choice they finally begin to receive. And as all of these shifts begin to integrate, this clarity, this restraint, this respect for one's own limits, there is a deeper transformation that quietly anchors everything else. The empath, who once looked outward for reassurance, for validation, for signs that they were enough, begins to turn inward in a way that feels steady, not desperate. For much of their life, their sense of worth may have been tied to how they were received. Were they appreciated? Were they needed? Were they seen as kind, as helpful, as understanding? And when those reflections from the outside world were positive, there was a sense of security. But when they were absent or inconsistent, something inside would waver. Now, that dependency begins to loosen. Not because the empath no longer values connection, but because they begin to see how fragile it is to build a sense of self on something that is constantly changing. People's opinions shift. Their moods fluctuate. Their ability to give recognition is often limited by their own struggles. And when your worth is tied to those variables, you are left in a state of quiet instability. So the empath begins to ask a different question. Not, do they see me? But do I see myself clearly? And that question changes the direction of their attention. They start to notice their own internal responses, their own values, their own boundaries, not as things to justify to others, but as things to understand within themselves. They begin to recognize when something feels right, when something feels off, and instead of seeking confirmation, they begin to trust that recognition. This trust doesn't arrive all at once. It builds gradually, through small moments of alignment. Each time they choose to honor their own feeling instead of overriding it, something strengthens. Each time they refrain from seeking approval for a decision they already know is right for them, something settles. There is less internal negotiation. And with that, a kind of quiet peace begins to emerge. It's not the absence of challenge. Life continues to bring complexity, uncertainty, and moments of discomfort. But the way the empath meets those moments changes. There is less urgency to resolve everything externally, less need to control how they are perceived, more willingness to remain grounded in their own experience, even when it's not fully understood by others. They begin to realize that being misunderstood is not the same as being wrong, and that realization is freeing, because it allows them to step out of the exhausting pattern of trying to manage other people's perceptions. They no longer feel compelled to explain every choice, to soften every truth, to make themselves more acceptable in order to maintain connection. Instead, they become more consistent with themselves. Their actions begin to reflect their inner clarity, rather than external pressure. And that consistency creates a different kind of confidence. Not loud, not performative, but deeply rooted. You can feel it in their presence. There is less tension, less striving, a sense that they are no longer trying to become something. They are simply allowing themselves to be without constant correction. And that ease doesn't come from perfection. It comes from acceptance. They begin to accept their sensitivity, not as a flaw but as a part of their nature. They accept their limits, not as weaknesses but as necessary boundaries. They accept their needs, not as burdens but as signals that deserve attention. And in that acceptance, there is dignity. Because when you stop rejecting parts of yourself to fit into someone else's expectation, you begin to stand more fully in who you are. Not rigidly, not defensively, but with a quiet assurance that doesn't need to be announced. The empath no longer seeks to be validated. They seek to be aligned, and from that alignment their relationships begin to shift. They are no longer drawn to connections that require them to prove their worth. They are drawn to those where their presence is met, not evaluated, where they are not asked to perform but simply to participate. This is where peace becomes something internal, not conditional. It is no longer dependent on being understood, appreciated, or affirmed at every turn. It comes from a deeper place, a relationship with oneself that is steady, honest, and compassionate. And when an empath reaches this stage, they are no longer defined by how much they give or how they are seen. They find their worth within, and from that place, nothing outside can take it away.